This is a PowerPoint video for Chapter 9. This PowerPoint consists of the dates 1776 to 1790. So it deals with the Articles of Confederation, our system of government during the Revolutionary War and leading up to then the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention led to the approval of the Constitution, ratification of the Constitution, and the election of George Washington. George Washington became our president in 1788, which is then a good 12 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Remember that the Declaration of Independence is signed in 1776, then we fight a 6 to 7 year Revolutionary War, then we have a period where we have the Articles of Confederation, then we have the Constitutional Convention, ratification of the Constitution leading to George Washington's presidency. All images within this PowerPoint are in the public domain. Please do not hesitate to email or give me a call if you have any questions. So Chapter 9, we're starting off with this idea of a shaky start. The Revolutionary War is over. Now what? And a couple of quotes out of the book. It's always difficult. It's always difficult to set up a new government, and doubly difficult to set up a new type of government. This democracy is a new type, a new form of government. And the departure of this conservative element, conservative Tory element, those that were wealthy and loyal to the throne, had departed. And this left a political system inclined towards experimentation and innovation, both a good thing and a difficult thing. And then the western lands were a big question mark. The chief apple of discord was western lands. All of those can be found on page 163. And then another interesting quote, and I could not find this in the book, I must have found it in a different book, but the exodus of some 80,000 substantial loyalist robs the new ship of this conservative ballast. And well, we've kind of gone over some of these things. This new country that is formed is run under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation very weak in federal power. And then we also have a very major problem, and it's an equity problem, where we have various states out. Well, Pennsylvania and Maryland, they had no holdings beyond the mountains, no western holdings, and they argued that these fortunate states, these land-holding fortunate states who did have land out west, so some of the states, like in particular Virginia, but North Carolina, whose border continued out west, New York continued, Massachusetts continued, these were very land-wealthy states. The land-wealthy states would not have these lands if all the other states had not fought for it just as much as they did during the Revolutionary War. And so the argument is, why should some states benefit from their land holdings while others would be land poor? So states with land holdings could sell off their lands to help finance their Revolutionary War debt, but the less fortunate, not land states, would have to resort to taxes. So this becomes a very big issue. The single most important piece of legislation then becomes this Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It establishes the precedent by which the United States would expand westward across North America by the admission of new states rather than the expansion of existing states. So that sets this precedence that in the future these areas would become new states. So New Jersey couldn't sell off their lands to help finance their debt, while Pennsylvania and other states, well, New Jersey, if you look down here, it was a state without land. But North Carolina could not sell this to pay for their debt when Pennsylvania would have to place high taxes on their people to pay for their debt. So the Articles of Confederation were established as a kind of a guideline, a principal union of the states, but when we look at this we can look at the weaknesses. Now this was adopted in 1776, right during the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence is July 4th, 1776, and all of the weaknesses. I want you to take a look here at some of the weaknesses. One vote for each state regardless of size, so all states were equal there, but Congress had no power to collect taxes. Taxes were all state taxes, not federal taxes. Congress had no power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. There was no national court system. And then you can only make a change or an amendment to this Articles of Confederation with the consent of all 13 states. And just, that's the amendment is to make a change. But just to make a simple law or an addition, you needed huge majorities, 9 out of 13, to pass laws. So the Articles was basically a firm league, a league of friendships with a lot of independence and autonomy within each state. So these were some of the crippling handicaps: no power to regulate commerce, no power to enforce and collect taxes. So the federal government as it existed was only there to advise, advocate, or appeal, not to command, coerce, or control. It was much more prestigious to be in a state government, like a governor or even a state legislator, than to be in this so-called federal government that had no power. So this led to troubled times. A loosely woven confederation, not a tightly knit federation. This involved yielding by the states of their sovereignty. And so we're going to have a group of people that are interested in bringing a stronger federal government. Eventually that's going to lead to a constitutional convention. As many people started to talk about the idea of a federal government that was a little bit more powerful, there was a trigger event that occurred, and it's called the Shays Rebellion, where a bunch of farmers in Massachusetts were having their farms foreclosed upon, and it turned into what your book talks about, a mobocracy, or unbridled republicanism, democratic despotism. But the leading financial powers that be in Massachusetts became pretty sober to the fact that there was no central powerful government that could actually put down a simple farmers' rebellion. This led to delegates gathering in Philadelphia and kind of secretly at first discussing the options of maybe disregarding or abolishing the Federation, the Articles of Confederation, and bringing in a constitutional government. So that leads us to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, summer of 1787. And it's almost striking to know which founding fathers were not present rather than those that were. And we'll come to that later. But there are 3 huge compromises that are necessary for this Constitution to eventually be ratified. Ratification takes place at the end of the summer and fall of 1787. The first compromise is referred to as the Great Compromise. Great Compromise consisted of 2 plans. The first plan was the Virginia plan, and then New Jersey, a smaller in population state, brought forward a different plan. Now, the results of these two plans leads to a bicameral Congress, the legislative branch. This is a picture of today's Congress. A bicameral Congress, meaning you have 2 seats, and you have a Senate and a House of Representatives. So this is Congress today. Now the 2 seats, or the 2 houses, the Virginia plan was based on population, and the New Jersey plan was based on each state having equal representation. Maybe we can try to write this down. So the Virginia plan was based on the Virginia plan was based on population, pardon my handwriting, and the New Jersey plan is based on equal. And so if we look at a state like Kansas today, in Kansas today, because of population, Kansas has 4 in the House of Representatives, but Kansas then gets 2 in the New Jersey plan in the Senate. Today it's called the United States Senate. California, based on population, gets 53. California, however, in the New Jersey plan gets 2. Based on population, then you have a state like Montana who gets 1 based on population, and then they also get 2. Equal in the Senate and based on population in the House of Representatives. So this right here would be a map of today's House Representatives. Remember, each state gets equal in the Senate. So California has 53, Arizona 8, Texas 32, again based on population. So a state like Pennsylvania has 19, New York has 29. Another very populous state would be Florida. Now each of these states gets 2 in the Senate. That's the compromise, a bicameral legislative group of lawmakers. Now another chart here that I want to call your attention to is a population chart. So you can look at states, let's see if I can get this to work. We can look at states, for instance, like Virginia. So let's look at Virginia's population here, and then let's look at a state like Massachusetts and Massachusetts population. And so you have population 360,000. You have Virginia's population 420. But look at the non-slave population, 475, 454, relatively close. But why is it that Virginia gets 5 more in the House of Representatives? And it has to do with the slaves. And we'll get to that with the next compromise. The other one we can look at maybe is North Carolina. Look at their population, non-slave, 293. And then you have a state, for instance, a free state like Connecticut, 235. But they get 10, and Connecticut gets 7. This becomes very important when you talk about legislative power in Congress. We'll look at that with the next compromise. So the second of the compromises at the Constitutional Convention was the Three-Fifths Compromise. Three-Fifths Compromise is between these free states and slave states, or North and South, divided at the Mason-Dixon line. Now these free versus slave states compromise, of course, is looked at why in this dawning Democrat age did abolition not go further and cleanly blot out the evil of slavery from the fresh face of this new nation? You're forming a new constitution, a new government. Why not just abolish slavery totally? Why was the fledgling idealism, this fledgling idealism of the Founding Fathers sacrificed to political expediency? Something interesting to look at. In the Founding Fathers, did they compromise? Okay, did they compromise the ideals of democracy? Did they compromise idealism just to get something accomplished politically? And James Madison, others said that the country would not exist as a whole if, in fact, slavery was not something to compromise on. So the compromise, of course, is to count 3/5 of the slave population in then the House of Representatives. And so that gets us back to this population chart. When you look at the various populations, that's where you have the Virginia population. The slave population is 292. The non-slave population is 454. But you don't just add 292 to 454. This is the population that you take, which would be only counting 3/5 of the 292. Don't count all of these, but you get 19. Now, according to states like New York, who have basically a non-existent slave population, or you take states like Massachusetts with 0 slaves. These two states, Massachusetts, New York, Massachusetts might in fact feel that this 14 and 10, they are appropriate numbers, but this 19, Virginia has a inflated power, an inflated number in the House of Representatives. Does that mean that the House of Representatives is maybe unfairly balanced towards the South? Does the South have an unfair advantage based on numbers in the House of Representatives, which eventually then also has a direct result on the Electoral College and a direct result on future presidents? And we'll look at that again in the future slides and chapters as well. That's the second compromise, the 3/5 compromise. So the first compromise that we talked about has to do with the Great Compromise between the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan, the Great Compromise. Then we talked about the slave states and free states, the 3/5 compromise. Now the last compromise has to do with a group of people calling themselves the Federalists, and they're the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wanted a strong central government, and then the Anti-Federalists, a little bit distrustful of a strong central government, and were interested in weak government, weak central government, and maybe particularly states' rights. So this would be a huge difference between the Federalists and then the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists party was maybe represented by people like Jefferson and Madison. The Federalists, they were kind of designating Washington as their leader, but probably their strongest leader was Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. Now the eventual compromise that results from this conflict between a strong and a weak idea of government, the eventual compromise is that we need to add a Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights to the Constitution. Now, the Constitution fundamentally is a list of things that government can do. And if you give government power, if you're giving government power, it's a strong government. So the Constitution gives government power. The Constitution the Federalists liked. Those that were kind of opposed to giving government too much power wanted a weak government, or at least some restrictions placed on the federal government. Those restrictions eventually become the Bill of Rights. So the First Amendment, government cannot make any laws restricting your rights to free speech, press, religion, and protest. Second Amendment right, your right to bear arms. Third Amendment right, so your right to be protected from illegal searches and seizures, so on and so forth. So the Bill of Rights that is added after the Constitution is adopted, this Bill of Rights, is the third compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanted a weak government. The Federalists wanted a strong government. The compromises adopt the Constitution as written, then later add a list of protections, add a list of things that government can not do. So the Constitution says what government can do. Bill of Rights is what government cannot do. Now, as the final Constitution is written, the final compromises are considered and adopted. Now we move to the ratification stage, and ratification requires what most thought originally to be 13 out of 13 states, but within the Constitution itself, they compromised that as well and said you only needed 9 states to ratify. During this ratification process, a lot of discussion and debate occurred, and some of the most famous opinions about why the Constitution was necessary were written by the Federalists and the Federalist Papers, a collection of essays printed in newspapers, written originally anonymously, but the authors later, it becomes known, are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. These guys discussed the meaning of the Constitution, the reasons why things were put into place, the reasons why it was necessary. Federalist Paper number 10 is probably the most important, talking about the rights of the minorities, the rights of the minority factions, the groups should be protected as a whole, that you don't need to distrust government. A strong government is necessary, but the interests of the whole community will, in fact, be protected. As these Federalist Papers are written, the main reason they are written is to try to convince the states of New York and Virginia to ratify the Constitution. As ratification occurs, we can look at these states. Originally, we only needed 9 out of 13, and if you look here, of course, Delaware is most immediate. They sign in early 1787. They ratify. Pennsylvania, look at the vote, fairly close, but pretty early. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Massachusetts, fairly close, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. At this point, June 21, 1788, ratification has occurred and the Constitution is a done deal. However, everyone does realize that the Constitution would be a failure if, in fact, Virginia and New York the leaders of the South and one of the most popular and wealthy states in the North, in fact, did not ratify the Constitution. So these are considered the laggard states, the last to ratify. Very close vote in Virginia, extremely close in New York. Thanks to the Federalist Papers, they were convinced, thanks to a lot of political maneuvering. Eventually, June 25th and July 26, 1788, these last several laggard states do ratify the Constitution. Now, it's interesting to note it takes a long time for Rhode Island to actually ratify, and it's still within a vote or two. Rhode Island, remember, going all the way back to a couple PowerPoints ago, Rhode Island was one of those colonies that originally had the most autonomy. They had the most independence. They didn't have to depend on the crown, and so they were very reluctant to join another entity and give up some of their state's sovereignty or their state's rights. So they are the last to actually ratify. But it becomes obvious that they cannot exist with these 12 states. They would not be able to exist on an island as an independent country. So those are the laggard states, but eventually ratification does occur. All 13 states join. The election of George Washington occurs in November 1788. November, the fall, 1788, George Washington then, as our first president, is sworn in early 1789. That concludes this PowerPoint video presentation. Again, a reminder that all images are in the public domain, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call or email. Thank you.